It was a rainy autumn evening in 1985. The small town of Maplewood had always been the kind of place where nothing ever happened, where doors stayed unlocked, kids played in the park until sunset, and the local library was more of a safe haven than just a building of books. That night, for children, Tommy, Sarah, Michael, and little Emily walked into the library together. They were best friends, each carrying their favorite book, laughing about homework, and whispering about ghost stories they had heard. Witnesses remembered them clearly. The old librarian even waved to them as they climbed the creaky wooden stairs to the children's reading room. But what happened after that? No one could explain. Because when the clock struck 9 and the library closed, the children never walked out. Their bikes were still chained outside. Their jackets were still draped over the coat rack. Their books lay open on the round wooden table, as if they had just stepped away for a minute. But the children, every single one of them, had vanished. Police searched every corner of the library, every aisle, every dusty shelf, every locked room, and even the dark basement where old archives were stored. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a clue. It was as if the children had been erased from existence inside the very walls of the library. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually years. The families never stopped searching, but the town grew quiet about it. Whispers of curses, secret passages, and ghostly hands pulling the children into the shadows haunted Maplewood. But as time passed, the case turned into nothing more than a dark memory until one night. Nearly 39 years later, something happened that sent chills down the spine of everyone in town. At dawn, the librarian arrived to open the building, and there, stacked neatly on the front desk, were 4 books. The very same books the children had borrowed in 1985. Their library cards were still tucked inside, the ink faded, but unmistakable. The books were in perfect condition, as if time itself had preserved them. No fingerprints, no cameras catching who left them, just silence. After nearly 4 decades, the children's books had come back home, but the children themselves were still gone. Before we dive deeper into this chilling story of mysteries, unsolved vanishings, and haunting tales fascinate you, make sure to subscribe right now. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the truth behind this terrifying disappearance. Because what you're about to hear will make you question whether those 4 children ever left the library at all. This story is not just about missing children. It is about silence that lingered for decades, about parents who never gave up hope, and about a library that slowly turned from a house of knowledge into a house of whispers. People in Maplewood always said the library kept secrets. Some said there were hidden tunnels beneath its floors. Others believed the place was cursed, built on land where something dark had happened long ago. But the truth is always more terrifying than the rumors. The return of those books was not just a coincidence, it was a message. A reminder that the mystery of 1985 had never truly ended. And tonight, we will uncover everything: the strange sightings, families' desperate search, the investigators who nearly lost their minds, the chilling theories about what really happened that autumn night. It was October 17th, 1985. A Thursday evening when the sun dipped earlier than usual and the air outside carried the smell of rain. Maplewood was the kind of town where nothing dangerous ever seemed to happen, the kind of place where parents didn't think twice about letting their children walk to the library together. That night, for children, Ami, Sarah, Michael, and Emily decided to spend their evening in the library, finishing homework and reading books. Tommy was 12, the oldest of the group, smart but playful. Sarah was 11, a quiet girl who loved fairy tales. Michael, also 11, carried a detective novel he had borrowed before. Emily, only 8, was the youngest, always clutching her little notebook where she scribbled stories of her own. Together they stepped into the Maplewood Public Library at around 6 in the evening, their laughter echoing softly against the tall glass doors. The librarian on duty, Mrs. Holloway, remembered the moment clearly. She saw them push the heavy doors open, their jackets damp from the drizzle outside. She smiled as they came in, their cheeks pink from the cold. Back again, she had teased, because those 4 children were regular visitors, almost like shadows of the library itself. They nodded cheerfully, waved to her, and ran upstairs toward the children's reading room. A college student named David, who was studying for exams at a desk near the stairs, also saw them. He recalled hearing their footsteps rushing up the wooden staircase, followed by the faint sound of Emily's giggle. Those small memories, which seemed so normal at the time, would later become haunting details burned into everyone's minds. The library closed at 9 that night. As the last of the visitors trickled out, Mrs. Holloway went about her usual routine, shutting down the desk, switching off the lamps on the lower floor, and calling out softly to remind the remaining readers that the doors would soon close. But something felt unusual. She realized she had not seen the 4 children come back downstairs. Their bikes were still locked outside, leaning against the brick wall in a neat row. Their small jackets still hung on the coat rack near the entrance. She assumed they were still upstairs, lost in their books. She walked up, the wooden steps creaking under her weight, but when she reached the children's room, her heart stopped for a second. The table in the middle of the room had 4 books lying open on it: Tommy's history book, Sarah's fairy tale, Michael's detective novel, and Emily's tiny story notebook. The chairs were empty, the room was silent, and the children were gone. At first she thought it was a game. Maybe they were hiding between the shelves, giggling quietly, trying to scare her. She walked aisle by aisle, calling their names: Tommy, Sarah, Michael, Emily, but only silence answered back. She searched the bathrooms, the stairwell, even the archive room in the basement, where the smell of mold lingered heavily in the air. Nothing. She returned upstairs, her voice trembling now as she called their names louder. The library was empty. It was as if the children had disappeared into thin air. By 9:15, panic set in. Mrs. Holloway phoned the children's parents, her voice shaking. Within minutes, worried families rushed into the library. Their faces turned pale when they saw the bikes outside and the coats still hanging untouched. The fathers stormed up and down the library, searching every corner. The mothers clutched at the books left open on the table, their tears dropping onto the faded pages. They were just here. They were just here, one of them cried, but there was no sign of the children. Not a sound, not a footprint, not even a hint of where they could have gone. The police were called immediately. Officers arrived with flashlights, radios buzzing as they spread through the building. They combed every shelf, knocked on every wall, even tapped the floorboards in case of a hidden trapdoor. The basement was searched twice, the attic once, the surrounding grounds outside thoroughly. Dogs were brought in, sniffing the children's jackets and notebooks. But the trail ended abruptly at the second floor of the library, as though the children had simply vanished into the air. There were no broken windows, no unlocked doors, no sign of struggle. Everything looked exactly as it always had, except for the unbearable emptiness where 4 young lives should have been. Word spread through Maplewood like wildfire. By midnight, crowds had gathered outside the library. People whispered in disbelief, their faces pale in the flickering glow of the streetlights. Mothers clutched their own children tighter, terrified that something evil had found its way into their safe little town. Fathers shouted at the police, demanding answers. The mayor arrived, speaking firmly about not losing hope, but his hands trembled as he gripped the microphone. For the first time, Maplewood felt like a place where safety had been broken, where innocence had been stolen. The families refused to leave the library that night. They searched alongside the officers, moving bookshelves, lifting carpets, opening dusty cabinets that hadn't been touched in years. They shouted the children's names until their voices cracked. But nothing answered back. The silence of the library became heavier, almost suffocating. It was the kind of silence that made people shiver, as though the building itself was hiding something. When dawn broke the next morning, the reality settled in. Porters crowded the entrance, snapping photos of the bicycles still chained in place. Television crews broadcast the story live, calling it one of the strangest disappearances the state had ever seen. Parents cried on camera, begging for their children to come home, their voices raw with grief. Posters with the children's faces were printed within hours and taped across every wall in town. But even as volunteers formed search groups, combing the woods, knocking on doors, searching abandoned barns and sheds, the library remained at the center of everyone's fear, because that was where the trail ended. 4 children had walked in, but none had walked out. Days turned into weeks, and the panic slowly gave way to despair. Police investigated everyone: neighbors, teachers, even the librarian herself. But no evidence was ever found. No fingerprints out of place. No signs of a break-in. No suspicious strangers reported in the area. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed the children whole. The parents' lives crumbled. Homes that once rang with laughter now echoed with silence. Birthdays passed with empty chairs at the table. Christmas lights went unlit because there was nothing left to celebrate. Every year the town gathered for vigils outside the library, candles flickering in the cold night air, but answers never came. The children of Maplewood had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only their open books, their jackets on a rack, and a wound in the town that never healed. As the days after the children's disappearance stretched into weeks, the Maplewood Public Library was no longer seen as a place of peace and learning. It was no longer the warm building where children gathered for story time, or where students came to finish their homework under the soft glow of yellow lamps. Instead, it became a place people avoided, a place whose tall windows looked more like watchful eyes than welcoming glass. And slowly, the whispers began. People in town, who once loved the library, started telling stories that gave shape to the fear they felt in their bones. It began with the night staff, the few brave employees who still agreed to keep the library running after the tragedy. They claimed that the building had changed, as though it had absorbed the grief and fear of what had happened. One guard reported hearing faint footsteps on the second floor long after closing when he knew he was the only person inside. Another said he heard the sound of pages turning in the children's reading room, soft and steady, but when he rushed up with his flashlight, the room was empty, the books untouched. There were even whispers of a woman's voice humming near the basement stairs, low and mournful, echoing through the stone walls when no one else was there. The flickering lights became another piece of the puzzle. The library had always had old wiring, but after 1985 the problem grew worse. Fluorescent lights would buzz and blink as though something unseen moved beneath them. Electricians were called again and again, but they never found a clear reason. Some townsfolk swore that the lights flickered only when someone mentioned the children. Others claimed the bulbs dimmed suddenly as if the building itself was breathing. Parents began telling their children not to step inside after dark, warning that the shadows in that library did not belong to the bookshelves. It wasn't long before employees began leaving. First, it was one of the younger assistants, who quit after only 2 months. She said she could not stand the constant cold spots in the children's section, where the air would grow icy against her skin, even when the heaters were running. And another librarian left, saying she had found her desk drawers opened each morning, as though someone had rifled through them during the night. The final straw came when Mrs. Holloway herself, the same woman, who had last seen the 4 children, retired earlier than expected. She never admitted the truth, but those who knew her said she was never the same after that night. Her smile faded, her eyes carried a constant shadow, and she avoided even driving past the library in her old age. The library's dark reputation only grew worse when people began to dig into its past. Local historians and reporters searched through Old Town records, trying to uncover anything unusual. What they found made the town shudder. The land where the library now stood had once belonged to the Maplewood Asylum, a crumbling institution that was shut down in the early 1900s after multiple patients died under strange and unexplained circumstances. There were stories of cruel doctors, patients locked in underground rooms, and experiments carried out in secret. When the asylum finally closed, the building was demolished. And years later, the library was built on top of the very same land. Some townsfolk claimed not all of it had been demolished. Rumors spread of old tunnels that ran beneath the property, used in the asylum days to move patients secretly from one wing to another. Others said the basement of the library sat directly on top of the asylum's morgue, though city officials denied it. Too many old maps and documents hinted that something had been left buried under the foundations. And if the stories were true, then the laughter of children that once filled the library had been built over screams that never faded. There were also reports of strange deaths tied to the library itself. In 1926, only a year after construction finished, a worker was found crushed beneath collapsed shelving. In the 1950s, a janitor suffered a fatal fall from the second-floor balcony, though no one could understand how, since he had been alone and there were no signs of slipping. Even in the 1970s, years before the children vanished, 2 librarians resigned after claiming to see figures moving between the shelves at night, long after closing. At the time, people brushed it off as nonsense, but after 1985, every strange death, every accident, Every resignation began to feel like pieces of a darker truth that had been ignored for too long. The townspeople began to treat the library as cursed. Children whispered about it at school, daring each other to sneak inside after hours. Teenagers would press their faces to the tall windows, swearing they saw shadows darting past the shelves, even when the building was locked and empty. Adults grew silent whenever the subject came up, lowering their voices and shaking their heads. The once beloved library had turned into a haunted monument, a reminder of loss and unanswered questions. But the families of the missing children carried the deepest scars. For them, the library was both a grave and a mystery. Every time they walked past its heavy doors, they felt the weight of what had been stolen from them. Some mothers left flowers on the steps each year, a quiet prayer that their children might somehow come back. Some fathers cursed the building, spitting on the ground as they passed, unable to forgive the walls that had swallowed their kids whole. The pain of not knowing made every rumor sharper, every story heavier.
Even as the years dragged on, the fear never left. People spoke of seeing lights flicker in the middle of the night, though the building was closed. Neighbors claimed they heard children's laughter drifting faintly from the open windows on summer evenings. And every now and then, someone swore they caught sight of a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching silently as though waiting for something. Some said it was Mrs. Holloway returning to check on her library. Others whispered that it was one of the children, still trapped inside after all these years. What began as simple superstition hardened into belief. The library was not just a place filled with books anymore. It had become a living thing in the minds of the people, a building that held secrets, that remembered what it had consumed, that refused to let go of the past. And for every rumor dismissed, another one rose, more chilling than the last. By the time nearly 4 decades had passed, the Maplewood Public Library was no longer a center of knowledge. It was a monument of dread, a place people crossed the street to avoid. And so, when the books of those 4 missing children suddenly reappeared on its front desk one quiet morning, no one was surprised that it happened there. For in the hearts of the people, the library had always been alive, waiting, and watching. The disappearance of the 4 children was more than a tragedy. It was a wound that never healed. For their parents, that October night in 1985 became the moment when time stopped. Everything that came before felt like another lifetime filled with birthday cakes, family dinners, laughter echoing in small houses, and the sound of bicycles racing down quiet streets. Everything after was an endless fog of grief, searching and waiting for answers that never came. Tommy's mother, Margaret, was the first to break down inside the library that night. She had rushed in with her husband, her hands trembling as she grabbed Tommy's jacket from the coat rack. It was still warm from his body, and the faint smell of grass clung to it. She pressed it against her chest and screamed his name, her voice echoing so painfully through the empty aisles that even the police officers lowered their heads. Sarah's father, Richard, tried to stay strong at first. He walked room by room, opening doors with steady hands. But when he saw Sarah's fairy tale book lying open on the table, a tear slipped down his cheek. He picked it up and held it close as if the worn pages were the last piece of his daughter he would ever touch. Michael's mother, Helen, collapsed on the floor when the officers told her they couldn't find him. She pulled at her hair and begged them to keep searching, screaming that her son was hiding, that he must be frightened and waiting for her. Emily's parents were the most broken of all. She was their only child, the little one who had just learned to ride her bike without training wheels. Her father lifted her notebook from the table and kissed the childish scribbles inside, whispering her name over and over as if repeating it would summon her back. That night, the library was not a building anymore. It was a tomb filled with broken families. In the days that followed, the parents refused to sleep. They joined the police in every search, walking through the woods with flashlights until their legs gave out. They knocked on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen their children. They stapled posters to every tree, every telephone pole, their children's smiling faces staring back at them from paper that quickly turned soggy in the rain. Exhaustion etched itself into their bodies, but hope kept them moving. Each night they told themselves that tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow, their children would come home. The town rallied behind them at first. Volunteers formed search teams that stretched across the county. People carried lanterns and combed through fields, barns, and old sheds. Some waded into the creek with sticks, searching for anything unusual. Helicopters circled above, their spotlights sweeping across the rooftops of Maplewood. Candlelight vigils were held on the library steps. Hundreds of people gathered, holding flickering flames against the night sky, their voices joining together in prayer and song. They sang for the children, for their safe return, for the parents who wept openly at the front of the crowd. Those vigils became a ritual, a way for the town to hold on to hope when answers refused to come. But as weeks turned into months, that hope began to wither. Volunteers stopped showing up in the same numbers. Search parties grew smaller, and eventually they stopped altogether. The posters faded under the sun, curling at the edges until the children's faces were nothing but blurry shadows. Reporters who once camped outside the families' homes packed up their vans and drove away to cover newer stories. The world moved on, but the families could not. They were trapped in that night, reliving it every time they saw a bike leaning against a wall, every time they heard a child's laugh in the distance. Inside their homes, grief took different shapes. Margaret, Tommy's mother, stopped cooking dinners. The kitchen, once filled with the smell of roasted chicken and apple pie, became silent. She would set the table for 4 instead of 3, unable to accept that her son's chair was empty. Richard, Sarah's father, spent hours sitting in his garage, staring at her old roller skates, his rough hands tracing the scratches she had left on them. Helen, Michael's mother, covered his bedroom in candles. Each night she lit them all, whispering that she would keep the light burning until he came back. Emily's parents left her room untouched, the small pink bedspread smoothed neatly, her dolls lined in a row on the shelf. They would stand in the doorway for hours, staring at the emptiness, holding each other as tears silently fell. The grief was not only personal, it strained marriages, friendships, and lives. Some couples grew distant, unable to look at each other without remembering what they had lost. Others clung tighter, finding comfort only in the shared pain that no one else could understand. The town watched these families with pity, but also with a certain discomfort. People didn't know what to say anymore. At first they offered casseroles, hugs, and words of comfort. Later, when the years passed and the children never came home, they avoided eye contact in the grocery store. The silence around the families grew heavier than the silence of the library itself. Every October, on the anniversary of the disappearance, the families gathered together on the library steps. They brought flowers, photos, and candles. Sometimes others joined. Sometimes it was just the parents alone in the cold, their faces lit by small flames. They prayed, they cried, they begged the night for answers. Each year they grew older, their hair turned gray, their voices weaker. But the grief never softened. It was raw, sharp, as if time had only deepened the wound instead of healing it. The police kept the case open for years, but eventually it became little more than a dusty file in a drawer. Officers were reassigned, detectives retired, and the town stopped speaking of it as often. But for the families, silence was unbearable. They wrote letters to news stations, pleaded with private investigators, even contacted psychics when logic failed them. They clung to every rumor, every wild theory, because doing nothing felt like betraying their children. Hope became both a comfort and a torment. It kept them moving, but it also tore them apart when each new lead ended in disappointment. By the time nearly 4 decades had passed, the families had changed, but their grief had not. Some parents had passed away with questions still heavy in their hearts. Others still lived in the same houses, refusing to move, convinced that one day their children might return. They carried the pain in their eyes, in the way their voices cracked when they said their names. The town had long grown quiet about the case, treating it as a ghost story from the past, but for the families, it was never past. It was every morning they woke up, every night they tried to sleep, every breath that hurt, because 4 young lives had been stolen without reason. The world had moved on, but they never could. Their grief had no ending, because the story of their children had no ending. The library still stood at the center of Maplewood, silent and cold, a constant reminder of what was taken. And the families, even after all these years, still waited for answers, for closure, for the impossible miracle of hearing the footsteps of their children rushing down the stairs again. The Maplewood Library did not remain just a building of silence after the disappearance of the 4 children. As the years went on, whispers grew louder, stories multiplied, and the library earned a reputation that made even the bravest hesitate to step inside. What made it worse was that these were not just wild rumors from children daring each other to invent ghost stories. They came from adults, from guards, from people who swore with trembling voices that they had seen something they could never explain.
Each story added another brick to the wall of fear that surrounded the library, turning it from a place of knowledge into a monument of dread. It began only a few months after the tragedy. A college student named Diane stayed late, preparing for her final exams. She sat at a table downstairs, surrounded by textbooks and empty coffee cups, when she thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye. Looking up, she noticed faint shadows dancing across the glass of the upstairs reading room. She squinted, telling herself it was only a trick of the light. But then, clear as day, she saw the shape of 4 figures, small like children, huddled together near the windows. Their outlines flickered as though they were lit by a candle flame that wasn't really there. She gathered her books and ran out that night, tears streaming down her face. Years later, she would still tell people she knew what she saw and that she never stepped foot in the library again. Other stories soon followed. Parents who walked past the library in the evening said they caught glimpses of movement upstairs. Some swore they saw a girl's small hand press against the glass, only for it to fade when they looked directly. Children walking home from school dared each other to look up, and some ran screaming when they thought they saw faces staring down at them. The library windows became eyes of their own, and many believed those eyes belonged to the missing 4. Then came the sounds. The night staff began reporting noises that sent chills down their spines. One janitor, an older man named Frank, swore he heard the sound of pages turning late at night. He was cleaning the main hall when he realized the noise was coming from upstairs. He thought perhaps someone had stayed behind, so he climbed the stairs with his flashlight. The reading room was empty, but the sound continued, pages flipping one after another, steady, deliberate. He shone his light on every table, every chair, every corner, but nothing moved. Yet the sound persisted until suddenly it stopped, leaving the room in suffocating silence. Frank left his job the following week, saying no paycheck was worth what he had experienced. Another night, a different staff member claimed to hear footsteps running across the wooden floors above. The quick, playful rhythm reminded him of children chasing each other. He smiled at first, thinking some kids had sneaked in. But when he called out, the footsteps stopped all at once. The silence that followed felt unnatural, heavy, as though something was listening to him. He rushed out of the building, and when he returned the next morning with other staff, the second floor was empty. Security guards, too, had their share of encounters. In the 1990s, when the town installed cameras to protect the library from vandalism, guards often sat in a small room watching the screens. More than once, they reported strange activity. Shadows moving where no one was, chair sliding a few inches on its own, books falling from shelves with no explanation. But what truly unnerved them were the whispers. Several guards described the same experience, sitting alone in the dark, staring at the monitors when they would hear voices drifting through the air vents. They were not adult voices, were soft, high-pitched, childlike. Sometimes laughter, but sometimes whispers, like secrets shared in the dark. And sometimes one guard swore, a voice calling his name. Those whispers seemed to come most often after midnight. Guards would patrol the halls, the beam of their flashlights cutting through the dust, and suddenly they would hear faint giggles behind them. Turning quickly, they would find nothing but empty shelves. One officer resigned after only 2 weeks, saying he woke up each night after his shifts with the sound of children laughing in his ears. Another claimed he saw 4 small shadows dart across the second floor, vanishing into the reading room, only for the room to be completely empty when he opened the door. Over time, these stories piled up. Some were dismissed as imagination, others as exhaustion from long shifts. But too many people said the same things for it all to be ignored. The 4 shadows, the sound of turning pages, the laughter and whispers that had no source. These were not tales told only by children on playgrounds. They came from grown men and women who had no reason to lie, people who shook when they remembered what they had seen or heard. The townspeople grew divided. Some believed the children's spirits were still inside, trapped between worlds, reaching out in the only ways they could. Others believed something darker lingered in the library, something that had taken the children and now mocked the living by mimicking their voices and forms. For the families, these stories were torture. On one hand, they offered hope, the possibility that their children were not gone forever, that some part of them remained. On the other, they deepened the nightmare, suggesting their kids were trapped in a place no one could reach, crying out from shadows that no one could truly answer. By the 2000s, the library had become a place of dares. Teenagers sneaked in after hours, filming themselves in grainy videos. Some laughed and made jokes, but others left terrified, claiming their cameras picked up faint whispers or shapes that weren't visible at the time. Urban explorers wrote blogs about cold spots in the basement where the air felt like ice even in the middle of July. People who touched the old wooden banisters sometimes claimed their hands felt suddenly small, so a child's hand had brushed theirs in passing. The library had become a story the town couldn't escape, no matter how much it wanted to forget. Still, the most chilling part was not the videos, the whispers, or even the shadows. It was the pattern. Almost everyone who claimed to see or hear something said the same thing. There were always 4 shadows, 4 voices, 4 presences moving together. It was as if the children had never separated, as if whatever had taken them had bound them forever within those walls. And so, even decades later, long after the world had stopped talking about Maplewood, the people who lived there knew the truth. The library was alive with something it should not have been. The 4 children who had walked in one October evening and never walked out were still there in whispers, in laughter, in shadows that flickered against the upstairs glass, waiting, watching, reminding everyone that the story was not finished. It was a cold evening in March 2024 when Maplewood Library, long known for its chilling reputation, found itself at the center of an even greater mystery. The building had aged with time, its walls carrying decades of whispers and shadows. But what was discovered that night sent shockwaves through the entire town. The new head librarian, a quiet woman named Mrs. Carter, arrived early to prepare for the day. The air outside was misty, the kind of fog that makes even familiar streets look strange. She unlocked the heavy wooden doors, stepped inside, and instantly froze in her tracks. Right there on the front desk, placed neatly as if someone had arranged them with care, were 4 books. At first, she thought perhaps a staff member had left them there overnight, but when she stepped closer, her heart dropped. Each book had a small name card tucked inside, the names written in faded handwriting. She gasped when she read them, the exact names of the 4 children who had vanished in 1985. They were the very books the children had checked out that evening, the books no one had ever seen again. The bindings were old, their pages yellowed, but they were intact. Each one looked as though it had been carefully kept, untouched by the nearly 4 decades that had passed. Mrs. Carter felt the hair rise on her neck. She dropped her keys, the metallic clatter echoing through the silent library. With trembling hands, she reached out but stopped herself, afraid to even touch them. It felt wrong, unnatural, as though the books themselves carried the weight of the missing children's souls. Word spread like wildfire. Within hours, police officers, town officials, and even journalists crowded the library. Some stared in disbelief, others whispered prayers under their breath. For the families of the missing children, the moment was devastating. Some of the parents, now gray and frail with age, arrived at the library in tears. They touched the books softly, as though they were touching their children's belongings for the last time. One mother collapsed against the desk, whispering her son's name again and again, while others stood silent, their eyes red with grief and shock. For nearly 4 decades there had been nothing, no clues, no explanations. And now, suddenly, the children's last possessions had returned as if the missing years meant nothing. The townspeople were torn between fear and wonder. Some believed the books were a message, perhaps even a sign that the children's spirits had finally found peace.
Ow.
Others saw them as a warning that whatever took the children was still out there, watching, waiting. Rumors spread faster than facts, and soon the streets of Maplewood buzzed with theories. Who returned the books? How did they appear inside a locked building? Could it have been a cruel prank? Or was it something much darker, something tied to the shadows that had haunted the library all these years? Experts were quickly brought in to examine the books. Historians, crime analysts, even paranormal researchers were consulted. Under bright lights in a controlled room, they turned the fragile pages with gloved hands, searching for any hidden writing, any symbols, anything out of the ordinary. Forensics tested the covers for fingerprints, but none were found. The ink on the name cards matched the handwriting recorded in 1985, confirmed by library archives. The books were genuine, yet what baffled everyone was their condition. Despite being gone for 39 years, they showed no signs of mold, no water damage, no decay. It was as though the books had been kept in perfect preservation, untouched by time itself. Some experts tried to calm the panic, insisting there was a rational explanation. Perhaps someone had stolen them back in 1985 and hidden them away, only to return them now. But even those explanations failed to comfort the town. If that were true, why return them now? Why leave them stacked so neatly, as though placed by invisible hands? And why had no one ever found a trace of them in all those years? The unanswered questions only deepened the dread. For the families, the return of the books was both a miracle and a curse. On one hand, it was the first tangible connection they'd had to their children in decades. On the other, it was a painful reminder of what had been stolen from them. Some parents admitted the sight of those books reopened wounds they had tried to close. One father said in a trembling voice, "It feels like they walked in last night and left their books on the desk. Like they were here, right here, and yet they're still gone." His words echoed in the hearts of everyone who heard them. Meanwhile, the townsfolk began avoiding the library more than ever. Some said they saw the books move slightly on their own, as if nudged by unseen hands. Others claimed the air around them felt heavier, colder, like walking into a place of mourning. Mrs. Carter herself refused to lock up alone after that night, always asking another staff member to stay until she left. Even she admitted that every time she walked past the desk, she felt watched. Theories grew darker as weeks passed. Some believed the books had not been returned by human hands at all. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed the children themselves had placed them there, finally reaching out after decades trapped in some other realm. Skeptics dismissed this, but offered no better explanation. Others whispered that the books were a clue, a sign that the mystery was not over, that the truth of what happened in 1985 was about to surface. Yet despite all the analysis, the mystery only grew deeper. The books were scanned, tested, even x-rayed. Nothing unusual was found. No hidden messages in the margins, no strange substances, no fingerprints, no trace of who had handled them. They were just ordinary library books except for the fact that they should not exist anymore. Their very presence was the mystery. By summer, Maplewood was no longer just a quiet town with an old haunted library. It became the subject of national headlines, documentaries, podcasts, and online discussions. People traveled from other states just to see the place where the books had appeared. Tourists pressed their faces against the library windows at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the four shadows rumored to still haunt the upstairs room. Some brought cameras, others brought candles, treating the site like a shrine. But for the locals, the sudden attention felt cruel. To them, this was not entertainment. It was pain-old wounds being prodded for the world's curiosity. And yet, for all the noise and speculation, the central truth remained the same. No one knew how the books returned. No one could say who carried them into the library, who stacked them so neatly on the desk, or why they appeared after nearly 4 decades. For many, it was the clearest reminder yet that the story of those 4 missing children was not finished. Something had been left unresolved in 1985. And now, after so many years of silence, the past was stirring once again. The return of the books was not closure. It was a question, a terrible, chilling question that demanded an answer. And until the truth was revealed, Maplewood would never find peace. When the 4 missing children's books returned to Maplewood Library in 2024, it was as if a locked door from the past had suddenly been flung wide open. For years, the town had lived with silence, carrying the weight of unanswered questions and faded memories. The case had grown dusty in old police files, spoken of only in whispers or in late-night conversations where people shared their theories. But now, with this eerie discovery, everything changed. Journalists, police officers, and even paranormal researchers rushed back into the story. Determined to dig up what had been buried for 13 years, the first to arrive were the journalists. Within days, reporters from across the state, and later from across the country, poured into Maplewood. They were hungry for details, eager to capture the mystery for newspapers, television, and podcasts. The sight of them setting up cameras outside the library stirred old pain for the families, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. For once, the children's disappearance wasn't being ignored. Their names were on people's lips again, their faces printed in articles once more. Reporters interviewed elderly witnesses who had been young when the tragedy struck. Some recounted seeing the children walk up the library steps in 1985, their laughter echoing against the brick walls. Others remembered the frantic search afterward, the helicopters, the police dogs, the endless posters stapled to lampposts. The reporters collected every memory, weaving them into stories that spread far and wide. For the first time in decades, Maplewood's mystery was alive in the public imagination. The police, too, could no longer ignore the case. The return of the books was undeniable evidence, something physical, something real, and it forced their hand. They reopened the old files, pulling out yellowed documents that smelled of dust and time. Officers who had worked on the case long ago were now retired, some even deceased, but their reports remained. Detectives studied the statements, the timelines, the maps marked with red circles where search parties once combed the woods. The original investigators had been thorough. But in 1985, there was no advanced technology, no DNA testing as sophisticated as today. Now the police had new tools, and they weren't afraid to use them. They dusted off the books once more, sending them to modern forensic labs. Specialists scanned them for microscopic traces of skin, cells, fibers, or particles that could reveal who had handled them. The results were baffling. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing human was found. Just dust that didn't match the air quality of Maplewood. Some scientists said the particles seemed to belong to a damp, underground environment. That revelation sparked a chilling theory. Had the books been hidden in some secret place beneath the town all these years? If so, what else might be down there? Detectives also interviewed the librarians who had worked at Maplewood Library over the decades. Some spoke of strange experiences, unexplained footsteps, whispers after closing. Books that seemed to vanish and reappear in different sections. One former staff member admitted she had quit her job because she could no longer handle the unsettling atmosphere. She described the library as hungry, as though it was a living thing that fed on silence and fear. The officers recorded her words, uneasy but unwilling to dismiss them. Then came the paranormal researchers. They were not bound by evidence or logic in the same way the police were, and they approached the mystery from another angle. To them, the return of the books was not a clue from a kidnapper or a prankster, was a message from beyond. Armed with cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and audio recorders, they set up camp inside the library. At night, when the building was closed to the public, they roamed the dark halls, their equipment glowing in the shadows. One night, a team claimed they captured the faint sound of children giggling in the upstairs reading room. Others swore they recorded whispers near the front desk, though no one else was there. The most unsettling moment came when a camera set up near the very spot where the books had been found flickered and distorted, as if something unseen had passed in front of it. When they reviewed the footage, some claimed to see shapes, small shadows moving across the desk. Skeptics dismissed it as tricks of light, but, for many, It was enough to believe that the children's spirits still lingered in the library. The town itself became divided. Some residents welcomed the investigators, hoping that new attention might finally solve the mystery. Others were angry, feeling their grief was being turned into a spectacle. Candlelight vigils were held outside the library, where townspeople prayed for peace for the children. Yet at the same time, tourists arrived in droves, drawn by the eerie story. Maplewood, once quiet and forgotten, now found itself at the center of a storm. The library that had once been nearly abandoned was now crowded with curious eyes and restless energy. For the families, the reopening of the case was a heavy burden. They sat once again with detectives, reliving the pain of their children's disappearance. Some admitted they felt hopeful maybe this time there would be answers. Others confessed they were terrified of what might be uncovered. What if the truth was even darker than they imagined? What if they were forced to confront the reality that their children had suffered in ways too terrible to speak of? Every lead seemed to open more questions than answers. The police chased down tips that led to nowhere. Journalists dug up old town records that hinted at strange accidents and deaths. Linked to the library land even before 1985, paranormal researchers claimed the building was built on cursed ground, a place where tragedy seemed to root itself deeply. Yet despite all these efforts, no one could explain why the books had returned in 2024, who had placed them there, or what had happened to the children. Nearly 40 years ago, the new investigations became a mirror, reflecting both the progress of time and the persistence of grief. Technology had advanced, theories had multiplied, but the void left by 4 missing children remained. Each group, the journalists, the police, the paranormal experts looked at the case through their own lens, but none of them could close the wound. The books were still there, locked in a glass case for safety, sitting like ghosts on display. People lined up to stare at them, but no one could touch, no one could explain. In the end, the new investigations reignited hope, fear, and obsession all at once. They proved that the past was not buried. It was alive, waiting, demanding answers. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Maplewood's mystery was not just about 4 children vanishing from a library. It was about something larger, something hidden in the shadows of the town itself, something that, even after 39 years, refused to let go. When the case of the 4 missing children was reopened after the shocking return of their books, people from all walks of life began to pour out theories. Some were grounded in logic, others dipped into the world of the supernatural. In a small town where the wound of loss had never healed, every possibility, no matter how strange, was whispered, debated, and feared. Theories became a way for the town to cope, to try and put a shape to the mystery that had haunted them for 39 long years. The first theory that spread like wildfire was that of secret underground tunnels. Maplewood was an old town, with a history of coal mining and hidden passageways beneath its streets. Some believed that the library, built on land that had changed hands many times, stood above a forgotten network of tunnels. According to this idea, the children may have stumbled upon a hidden door or floor hatch inside the building in 1985. Perhaps they were exploring, their curiosity pulling them deeper into the dark passages below. The thought was chilling for innocent kids wandering into pitch-black tunnels, getting lost where no one could hear their cries. Supporters of this theory pointed to the strange, damp dust found on the returned books, which seemed out of place inside the library itself. Maybe the books had been resting underground all these years, hidden in a chamber that no one had discovered. If the children had fallen, or been trapped there, it might explain why not a trace of them was ever found. But if that were true, the question remained, who returned the books? Could someone else have been living down there, protecting the secret all these decades? The tunnel theory gave people goosebumps, because it felt disturbingly possible. Then came a darker idea, a cult using the library for rituals. For years there had been hushed rumors about strange gatherings in Maplewood, secret groups that worshipped things not spoken of in daylight. Old newspapers even hinted at odd disappearances and unexplained fires near the edge of town in the 1960s and 70s. Some theorists believed that the library, with its eerie history and secluded corners, was the perfect meeting ground for such a cult. The children, they said, may not have simply vanished, they may have been taken. The cult theory suggested that the kids were chosen as part of a ritual. something designed to bind their souls or to feed a darkness that demanded sacrifice. People who believed this pointed to the fact that librarians often quit suddenly, describing feelings of being watched or hearing noises no one else could hear. Was it possible they had seen something they weren't supposed to? The return of the books, in this view, wasn't random at all. It was symbolic, an offering or a message. Maybe the cult had resurfaced, reminding the town that their power still lingered. The most frightening and yet strangely comforting theory to some was the supernatural explanation that the library itself was alive, trapping souls. People described the building as if it breathed, as if it had moods. Strange drafts moved through rooms without windows. Lights flickered even after being rewired. Books went missing, only to reappear in strange places. To those who believed in the supernatural, the library wasn't just a building, it was a vessel. They thought that when the children entered in 1985, they never left because the library itself claimed them. Perhaps their souls were absorbed, caught in the endless rows of shelves and the echo of turning pages. The strange sightings over the years, the giggles, the whispers, the shadows in the upstairs reading room were proof. They argued that the children were still inside, forever trapped. The return of the books in this explanation wasn't evidence of foul play or tunnels. It was the library itself releasing a small piece of what it had taken, reminding everyone that it still held the rest. This theory terrified many, but for some grieving families, it gave comfort. Because if their children's spirits were in the library, maybe they were not gone. Maybe they were still near. And then there was the strangest, most mind-bending theory of all: a time anomaly. According to this idea, the children had not died, nor been taken by cults or swallowed by tunnels. Instead, time itself had shifted around them. Perhaps the library stood on a place where the veil between times was thin, a doorway between past and future. Some believe that on that day in 1985, the children had walked not into danger, but into another moment of history entirely. If that were true, then somewhere maybe just beyond the walls we see, they were still alive. They hadn't aged, hadn't grown up, hadn't suffered. They were still clutching their books, their laughter frozen in the air, living the same day over and over. The return of the books was explained as a kind of bleed-through, a moment when objects slipped from one timeline to another. To believers in this theory, it meant there was still hope. Maybe one day the children themselves might return, unchanged, as if no time had passed. But this hope was also its own torment, because what if they never did? What if they were trapped forever in a loop no one could break? Each theory carried its own weight, its own darkness. The tunnels pointed to an accident, the cult to human evil, the supernatural to forces beyond comprehension, and the time anomaly to a mystery that defied every rule of reality. Families of the children were divided, some clinging to the most logical explanations, others finding solace in the strangest ones. The police leaned toward the tunnel theory. Journalists loved the cult story because of its drama, and paranormal researchers swore the library itself was cursed ground, but the truth was, no one knew. The books sat behind glass in the library, silent witnesses that refused to tell their story. And as the town debated, one thing became clear: theories were all they had. For 39 years they had searched for answers, and now, even with new investigations, those answers remained out of reach. But theories kept the children alive in memory. They kept the story from fading. And maybe, just maybe, one of them was the truth waiting to be uncovered. The chilling climax of the story came not in 1985, but decades later, when investigators once again walked into the library under the cover of night. By then, the town had grown older, quieter, but the memory of the missing children still hung in the air like a ghost nobody could shake. When news spread that paranormal researchers and police had agreed to spend the night inside the library to search for answers, people gathered outside, standing in silence, as if waiting for the building itself to breathe again. The clock struck midnight, and the investigators entered, their flashlights cutting across the dusty hallways, their voices hushed by an invisible weight that seemed to rest on every book, every shadow. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Rows of books, old wooden shelves, the faint smell of paper and polish. But slowly, the air began to shift. It grew colder, so cold that their breath rose in faint clouds, despite the heaters being on. One investigator swore he felt something brush past him, though no one else was near. The sound of pages turning echoed faintly in the reading room upstairs. They moved cautiously, recording every sound, every flicker of light. What they didn't expect was how closely the night would begin to mirror the very day from 1985 when the children vanished. At 1:15 a.m., the group reported hearing footsteps light, quick, almost playful. They followed the sound, only to find nothing. But their equipment captured faint whispers, voices too soft to fully understand, though one word seemed to stand out. Come. At 1:47 a.m., the lights flickered violently, plunging the library into darkness for a few seconds. When the power steadied, the investigators were stunned to see that 4 books now lay open on a table in the children's section. They were the exact same titles the missing kids had borrowed in 1985. Even though those copies were locked behind glass on the other side of the building, fear began to creep into their bones, yet something pushed them forward. As if they were retracing the very steps of the children that night long ago. As the clock neared to a.m., the atmosphere grew heavier, almost unbearable. The team felt watched, surrounded, as if unseen eyes followed their every movement. Suddenly, one of them, a seasoned officer who had dismissed the paranormal, froze in place. He pointed toward the upstairs reading room, where faint shadows moved across the wall. Small figures the size of children, darting between shelves. The group rushed upstairs, their cameras rolling, but as soon as they entered, the room was empty. Only silence greeted them, though several swore they heard the faint giggling of children fading into the distance. And then it happened, the event that shook even the most hardened skeptics. At 2:17 a.m., the building itself seemed to come alive. The temperature dropped sharply, their flashlights flickered, the sound of 4 sets of footsteps echoed around them, circling the group. One investigator shouted that he saw a small handprint appear in the dust on a nearby table, fresh as if pressed only seconds ago. Another claimed he felt the tug of a sleeve as if a child had tried to lead him away. Panic set in, but before they could retreat, the sound of the front door slamming shut echoed through the halls, though no one had touched it. They were trapped inside. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Objects shifted on their own books, sliding off shelves, chairs creaking as if someone invisible had sat down. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, until they sounded almost like cries. Some investigators covered their ears, trembling under the weight of the noise. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. The air grew still, the whispers vanished, and the door unlocked itself with a loud click. Shaken and pale, the team fled the library, their cameras and audio recorders capturing fragments of the impossible. When they reviewed the evidence later, the recordings revealed something chilling. A child's voice, clear and soft, whispered, "We're still here." Another tape, distorted and scratchy, carried what sounded like the faint cries of 4 children calling for their mothers. The investigators, hardened professionals, could not explain it. They had entered the library looking for answers, but instead found themselves caught in what felt like a replay of the night in 1985, a haunting that refused to let go of its past. The town was shaken once more. People gathered outside the library, whispering about the events. Some begged for the building to be torn down, claiming it was cursed ground. Others argued it should remain standing, a memorial to the lost children, a place where their presence lingered. But the truth was, no one could deny the strange and terrifying experiences of that night. The library had revealed something, yet not enough. To this day, the questions remain unanswered. What happened to those 4 children on that summer afternoon in 1985? Were they trapped forever within the walls of the library, caught between worlds? Were they victims of something darker, something human, or something unearthly? And why, after 39 years, were their books returned so suddenly, as if time itself had bent to deliver a message? The library still stands, though few dare to enter after dark. Visitors sometimes claim to hear laughter, or to feel the brush of a small hand against their arm. Parents warn their children not to linger too long near the shelves. And every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, candles appear at the library's steps, burning in memory of the 4 kids who walked in and never came out. The chilling climax of this story is not just the terror inside the library, but the silence that follows the way the unanswered questions still haunt everyone who remembers. Because deep down, The people of Maplewood know the truth. The mystery of the missing children may never be solved. The library holds its secrets tightly, and perhaps it always will. The story of the 4 children who vanished inside the library has no neat ending, no final chapter that gives peace to the families who waited decades for an answer. For the parents, brothers, sisters, and grandparents, life became a long, aching cycle of hoping and hurting. They carried the grief like a heavy stone, pressing down on their hearts every single day. Some grew old, still waiting for the knock on the door that never came, still leaving the porch light on in case their children found their way back home. Others passed away without closure, taking their questions with them to the grave. For those still alive, the return of the books in 2024 did not heal them. It tore the wound open again, reminding them of what they had lost and what they would never truly understand. It was like receiving a message from the past, not of comfort, but of haunting. Every year on the anniversary, the families gather quietly. They stand outside the library holding candles, their faces lined with both age and sorrow. Some whisper prayers, others just stare at the dark windows of the building, as if expecting to see small faces looking back. And though nearly 40 years have passed, the grief never softened in the way people said it would. It only settled deeper, becoming part of their identity. They were not just parents or siblings anymore. They were the families of the missing, bound together by a loss that time refused to erase. For them, closure was a word people threw around, but it was never real. How could you close the chapter on children who had vanished into thin air? What makes the pain worse is the fear that lingers in every shadow of that library. When investigators reported seeing shapes and hearing voices inside the building, it shook the town to its core. Was it truly the children, their spirits still trapped, calling out in the only way they could? Or was it something else entirely, something that had lured them in and never let them go? That question is the nightmare that won't let anyone rest. Families wonder, if the children's souls are inside, are they suffering? Are they scared? Or are they simply lost, unable to find their way out of the darkness? That thought alone has kept many from ever setting foot inside the library again. Even people with no connection to the case carry the weight of fear. Children in town grow up hearing the whispers. Parents tell their kids not to wander too close to the building after dark. Teenagers dare each other to go inside, but even the bravest don't last long before running back out, pale-faced and shaken. The library has become more than a place of books. It has become a symbol of everything unknown. A reminder that evil or mystery can hide in the most ordinary of places. It is a scar on the town, one that everyone can see, but no one can heal. And yet perhaps the cruelest part of this story is that it resists every attempt to solve it. Journalists, detectives, and paranormal researchers have all tried. But the case remains locked, as if the truth is buried too deep for humans to reach. Some mysteries tease us, giving fragments of answers, but this one only grows darker the closer you look.